the truth about the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Watchtower 10-part series. Answers to every question you may have and questions you should be asking. This is part 6 of 10, and we are going to be covering in this video a very sensitive subject, and it's sensitive because how many lives have been lost due to this topic, and the topic is dangerous and inconsistent medical teachings of the Watchtower and how they infringe upon the human rights of human beings, especially children that have really no say. They just have to submit to what it is their parents are deciding when it comes to matters of their health. So my concern with this is, where is the sanctity of human life found in the teachings of the Jehovah's Witnesses regarding blood transfusions, organ donations, and things such as this that really boil down to a matter of life or death? Is it possible they have it all turned around? And how many more lives will be lost due to these teachings? I see a lot of ignorance and hypocrisy in these teachings, especially when I look at from the very, very early, the onset of the Watchtower organization to now throughout history, how many times the teachings have changed and continue to change to this day. In Leviticus, looking at the Bible, Leviticus chapter 19, 16, it says, "Neither shall you stand by the blood of your neighbor." And what it's talking about is the sanctity of life and the responsibility that we have as fellow human beings on this earth to do whatever we can to prevent the loss of life when it's in when it's in our power to do so. And in Jewish law, they have a principle called pikuach nefesh. And what this means is the saving of a life. And this principle governs their conduct, and it is held as the highest order, even above the Torah, which means if you have to choose between adhering to one ordinance or commandment or watching a person die or allowing them to die or doing or not doing something that could potentially lead to their death, you are instructed to do whatever you can to ensure their safety above all other commandments. Meaning, if you have to break a commandment in order to save their life, then that is what you must do for the preservation of life. So this principle in Jewish law is based on that scripture and many other scriptures, that the preservation of human life must override virtually any other ordinance or commandment. And I personally stand very firmly behind this principle, that the sanctity of human life must be held in the highest regard, regardless of what your present religious belief system may be. That as fellow human beings in this family on earth, we need to look out for one another, and we need to do whatever we can to assist an individual when they are in a time of crisis or great need, where when we have the ability to act and it will assist them in preserving their life, we must do so. We must govern our decisions according to the preservation and sanctity of life. Always number one above everything else. And it is my belief that when we do this, there will be times when we're having to choose the lesser of two evils. And in the Jehovah's Witness religion or organization, they're constantly choosing to strain out the gnat and swallow the camel. And Jesus clearly taught against this, and we're going to look at that. But I really want to focus on the fact that we have a duty to do what we can to preserve life when it's in our power to do so. Now, I want to take a look at Matthew chapter 23 for those of you who are coming into watching this 10-part series that are Bible-believing individuals. I know some of you watching this are not. I'm kind of in a place, like I've said in some of the previous videos, previous ones to this. And if you haven't watched them, please go back and do that. But that I'm in a place where I'm not sure of what my beliefs are. And so as I use the scriptures throughout this 10-part series, it's with the assumption that the viewer is, if they're interested in becoming a witness, or they are one now, at the very least, they probably consider themselves to be a Christian. And so I do use scriptures throughout because that obviously is your measuring stick for what is right and just and holy. So in Matthew 23, when I read the entire chapter start to end, I see God's heart, and I see what his heart would be today, watching how the Jehovah's Witness organization makes very treacherous and abominable decisions, not only for themselves, but then forces their members to follow suit in things that can literally cost the lives of their children, their partners, their parents, their loved ones. And when I see the way that they have such a lack of care, lack of justice for the helpless, the broken, the innocent, the vulnerable, the meek, the weak, to me it's absolutely devastating, and it's just riddled with hypocrisy. Jesus said in Matthew 23, and I'm going to paraphrase and condense this, but look for where there may be some, I guess, if you were to do a side-by-side comparison of the Pharisees and Sadducees of that day and the way they were interacting with the people, and compare that with the Jehovah's Witnesses today and how they're engaging and ruling their people, see if you can see anything that may be in common here, because I do, and it just like literally jumps out at me. And I see so many parallels throughout that entire chapter that I had to just go through and kind of do a quick paraphrase and condense it for you guys. So in a nutshell, here's what it says in Matthew 23. The scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. They bind heavy burdens, too grievous to be borne, and they lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with even one of their fingers. But woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. You devour widows' houses. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to make one convert, but once successful you make him twice the child of hell that you are. Woe to you, blind guides. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. You pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, but you have omitted the weightier matters of the law: judgment, mercy, faith. You blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, For you make clean the outside of the cup, but the inside is filled with extortion and excess. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You are like white sepulchres that appear beautiful on the outside, but are filled with dead man's bones and uncleanness. Even so, you outwardly appear righteous to men, but within you are filled with hypocrisy and iniquity. So why do I feel so passionately about this subject? Why am I doing this entire 10-part series, and why have I invested months of my life into this? It was because I was born with a principle written on my heart and in my soul and in my mind. And the best way to describe this principle is through Proverbs chapter 31, verse 8, that says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves." And I think about parents who are burying their children right now because they were not allowed, they were forbidden to give their child a blood transfusion. For the widow who is grieving over her partner because she was not allowed to give him a blood transfusion that would save his life. And for those from times past when Jehovah's Witnesses forbid even organ transplants, all the lives that were lost and the pain that resulted from that could have been saved. When if they would have only been alive during this time, and the Jehovah's Witnesses have now changed their rulings on that, all of those lives would have been saved. I think about those things, and it is subjects like that that motivate me to speak up for those that cannot speak up for themselves, in the hopes that someone hearing this, seeing this video, will choose to not subject themselves to such tyranny and cruelty and hypocrisy. In Micah 6:8 it says, "Learn to do good, seek justice, and correct oppression." And that is the heart behind why I'm doing this series. So if Jehovah's Witnesses were to give their blood, or were to give a blood transfusion to their family is told that they now must disfellowship them or disown them. And having to decide between, are you going to break the rules and save a life, with the risk that if you save that life, once they come to and recover, they may never talk to you again because the decision you made. Or do you just let them pass away and continue on in the organization in good standing? I mean, these are the decisions that people in this organization have to make. I look at 1 Timothy 5:8, and it says, "If anyone does not provide for his relatives, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." But we are told in the scriptures that the second greatest commandment of all is to love our neighbors as ourselves. Yet in this one doctrine alone, the Jehovah's Witnesses teach that you are to turn your backs on your relatives if they break any of the Jehovah's Witnesses rules, including any of their medical-based tenets of faith, such as taking blood transfusions. So like I said, if you were to be solely responsible for caring for your mother or your father, let's say they were aging, and your mother or your father, they were also a Jehovah's Witness, and they ended up having to take a blood transfusion. If they were to take a blood transfusion and recover, they would be dissociated, and you would be in a situation where you may be forced to have no interaction with them, which also means abandoning caring for them even. That is to me a very, very grievous thing. And to have to turn our backs on our family members because the religion that we have chosen to be part of says so, I have very big concerns with that. So I want to look at some of the dangerous medical teachings of the Watchtower, based on what they have enforced throughout history and the changes that they have made, and the lack of preservation of life that they seem to adhere to. They don't seem to have a lot of respect for that. Through the scriptures, we're instructed to do no labor on the Sabbath, just as an example. We're to rest on the Sabbath. But even in the scriptures, we see countless times where there are exceptions to that rule. And it always boils down to the preservation of life always being what is most important. And so we can look at Luke 14, verse 5, where it says, "Then he asked them, if one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out?" And the reason that Jesus was talking about this was because he was being bashed for healing on the Sabbath and, letting his disciples, eat grains of wheat that they would just be picking by hand going through the fields on the Sabbath. And there were a lot of rules against doing anything on the Sabbath. Yet he was saying, in a nutshell, of course, I'm paraphrasing again, like, come on, guys. I mean, what's the heart of the matter here? And I think the entire Jehovah's Witness organization and the doctrine that they have come up with completely misses the heart of the matter: justice, faithfulness, love, sanctity of human life, things like that. Just the foundational things that really should make up any healthy faith system are completely void in their religion. And they do strain out a gnat and swallow a camel repeatedly throughout their doctrine, and their medical teachings are a very prime example of that have the most grievous of consequences. In Deuteronomy 22:8, we see, when you build a new house, you must build a railing around the edge of its flat roof. That way you will not be considered guilty of murder if someone falls from the roof. And this is just one of many scriptures where you can see that we are to take our duty very, very seriously when something we do or don't do could cause an individual to be harmed or die. That blood is on our hands. If there was something we could have done to have prevented it. And there are many, many scriptures that talk about this, but they don't talk about those. What they do is they twist the scriptures and take them out of context to make it that you need to submit to these medical teachings, and they really just zero in and focus on those scriptures without stepping back and looking at the big picture. What's the big picture here? And the big picture of the scriptures, according to the way that any Christian would see them anyhow, the big picture is about love and the sanctity and preservation of life, and love being the greatest of them all, mercy and justice and faithfulness. So what can a Jehovah's Witness be disfellowshipped for regarding medical teachings? Let's have a look at them, and they're going to boil down to, what period of time are we talking about? Because it depends on what year you're referring to in history. So for example, let's say we go back to 1925. Watchtower marketed a special machine that they claimed was 100% effective at diagnosing illness anywhere in the body. Yes, they did. It was called the electronic radiobiola. You guys can look this up. And they claimed that it could detect and heal patients by sending radio waves into the body. This is from the Golden Age, April 22nd, 1925, page 453 to 454. Guess what? If you were to speak against this device, you would be disfellowshipped. If you were just to, start saying, hey, I'm kind of not buying that quackery, something wrong with that thing, you would be removed from the organization and disfellowshipped for that. So that's something to think about. I mean, they had all kinds of things like this, but the ones I'm going to focus on in this video are more the blood transfusions and that, because that's kind of something that there have been a lot of lives throughout history lost for this reason alone, including lives that are continuing to be lost. So for example, Eloise Dupuis, she passed away. She was 27 years of age following a birth complication in Quebec. If she would have received 2 or 3 pints of blood, she would not have died. It would have saved her life. She had a little boy named Liam who will now never know the love of his mother's embrace. And for what? They strain out the gnat and they swallow the camel. Which one is the greater of the two evils here? A child who is going to be raised now without a mother, a husband who has lost his wife, who will now raise that child on his own, or a woman who would have received 2 or 3 pints of blood and continued on with her life to be able to be part of her family and raise her child. They strain out a gnat and they swallow a camel, and they force their members to do the same. And if you don't obey, then you suffer the consequences. So like I said, blood transfusions to the Jehovah's Witnesses is considered a mortal sin. And those who accept blood, they teach, will be killed in Armageddon. And in the immediate, they will be dissociated, and in some places disfellowshipped and shunned. If they have taken blood, or obviously they're not allowed, they're forbidden from donating blood. If you were to give blood to a family member that you're responsible for, so on. You are taught that you must let yourself die as a good steward and faithful and loyal to God if you're in the situation where you require blood. And there has been a lot of changes over the years regarding this, and I'm going to go through some of those. Their modern teaching is a lot more lenient, where they're allowed to take fractionated blood products now, almost the entirety of the blood, as long as they've been fractionated, so separated. They're allowed to take the hemoglobin, which consists of about 15% of the blood is hemoglobin. They're allowed to take that now. So there's been a lot of changes over the years, and what's interesting about that is every ordinance, every doctrine they have, they claim they are the mouthpiece of God, and here is what God says. Here's God's judgment on this. Here's God's heart on this. But then a year or two later, no, sorry, God changed his mind. Here's what God really says about this. Here's what he feels about this now. I mean, the scriptures also say that God is the same today and tomorrow and yesterday and forever, and he doesn't change. So which is it? Is God really teaching the Jehovah's Witnesses what he has to say about organ donations, blood transfusions, and everything else, not to mention the medical, the medical doctrines that they have, the medical teachings they have? What about everything else? Is God really choosing the Jehovah's Witnesses as his one and only mouthpiece on this world, on this earth, in this world? And if so, why will he never get his story straight? Why treat us like a bunch of ping pongs just all over the place, where this year he says this and that year he says that, and it's just, not to mention the fact that we have to deal with such grievous consequences when we struggle to adhere to the most recent verdict or the most recent teaching, And that's some things to think about. So personally, I say no. I say that any witness or future witness needs to say no needs to say no to this insanity and this chaos. It's tyranny, and the consequences are so grievous. Something to think about is if you ever end up in a situation and you're a Jehovah's Witness and you go into a hospital and you require a blood transfusion, they have a committee of Jehovah's Witnesses. The committee of Jehovah's Witnesses in each of these hospitals, their responsibility are to, basically it's to be a spy, to find out if you take a blood transfusion, and if you are being presented with the medical team is coming to you saying, hey, you need a blood transfusion, their job is to make sure that you are reminded that this is a grievous sin to do this and to talk you out of it. That is their job, and they are there at the hospital as a committee, specifically with that one role, to make sure that no Jehovah's Witness takes a blood transfusion, and to tell on them if they do, so that way they get dealt with accordingly for their sin. And my suggestion is that you make sure that you and your family, if you are a present Jehovah's Witness, that is, that you and your family refuse to have any Jehovah's Witness committee at a hospital involved in your care, meaning they do not get to come into your room or interact with you or your family, and they don't have any access to what is going on in that room. So that way you can decide for yourself if you choose to disclose to them that you did or didn't receive a blood transfusion, or you did or didn't give it to your child or your partner, that you have the right, the human right, to choose what you disclose to them, and you have the human right to privacy during your stay in the hospital and when you're receiving medical attention. They have no right to access that. So keep that in mind. Remember that you have right to your privacy. Jehovah's Witnesses, they have changed their stance on the blood transfusion topic so many times that even though your desire may be to follow God's law, God's ruling on this subject, if you're turning to them for that advice as to if it's right or if it's wrong, you have to keep in mind how many times they have changed it, in order to decide if you can really get that information from them that you're looking for. If your desire is the desire of your heart is to know, what does God really teach about this? You never want to turn to a source that changes their mind about it every decade or two. They're not a reliable source then for that information. You're going to need to find a different source then. Up until the 1980s, organ transplants were forbidden as well, and they considered organ transplants to be cannibalism, and they were not allowed it, and anyone who was to take it was also disfellowshipped. But now they're allowed organ transplants, void of any consequence. So once again, if God was the one authoring these decisions, creating these doctrines, why does he keep flip-flopping all over the place and saying yes, no, maybe so? That's not the way he would work. So their God-given guidance on who is to live and who is to die has changed over 10 times regarding blood transfusions alone since the beginning of this, the introduction of this doctrine. Over 10 times they have changed their minds from 1940 to 1995. And they have went back and forth, and even allowing way more liberties starting in around 2000, where that you can receive just about everything as long as it's all separated. All the components are separated. So now they're allowed to have all of these different fractions, where back in, whatever it would have been 1980, you would have still been disfellowshipped for that, or dissociated for that. Disassociated. So I've counted over 14 changes That took place between 1940 and 1995 alone. 14 different changes to their blood laws. Their rules on this one are definitely not theologically or biologically sound. They are extremely inconsistent, and I would not subject myself or my family to any of them for the sake of holiness, because it's just not scripturally based at all. You have to think, would you really want to let your child or your spouse die for an edict that they have changed 14 times? Are you really prepared to lay down the life of someone you love or yourself for something that is so clearly inconsistent? The preservation of life scripturally needs to be the focus, and there is no preservation of life in that doctrine whatsoever. It's the complete opposite. So when did the anti-blood transfusion doctrine begin? Let's take a look at it. It originated in 1945 in the publication that went out on January 7th that made it very clear that it was wrong to take blood. In 1961, they wrote that you will be disfellowshipped for receiving it. Today they teach that you may not be disfellowshipped, but that you should instead be disassociated from the organization. In 1919, blood transfusions were allowed, and that actually went on until their change of the doctrine in 1945. So this blood teaching, like I said, it's very inconsistent throughout the entire history of their organization. What they're teaching now in 10, 20, 50, or 100 years from now may be completely obsolete. So do you really want to risk laying your life down or losing one of your closest family members for something that they most likely are going to change again within the next decade? In the year 2000, witnesses were now allowed to accept certain blood derivatives based on their own conscience. So as long as it wasn't the whole blood and it was certain blood derivatives, you can see in the June 15th writing of the year 2000, page 29, they said that they were now allowed to do it based on one's own conscience. So once again, that's another change. So how can it be seen as just or fair for witnesses to accept blood from others in these derivatives? So they're allowed to accept blood now, in part, but they're still forbidden from donating. So how is this fair that we have a certain group of people on the earth that are allowed to take from our donated blood supply, but they never are contributing to it? How is that okay? So that's just another issue. And if we look at the fundamental tenets of the Christian faith, love, faith, mercy, justice. What is just in a group of people being willing to suck a life-saving force out of society and never replenish it and never be part of the people giving to it? I have very big problems with that. Now, I don't know if I've mentioned him. I think I've mentioned him one other time. Raymond Franz, he was a former member of the governing body. So the governing body is the 8 men that basically are the rulers of this organization. They are the ones that sit at the top. They make all the rules. They write the doctrine. They do all of it. They are the head of the organization. They are the head of the religion. Raymond Franz was one, and he no longer is, obviously. But he wrote a book that is going to be very interesting for you guys to look up and read. And he talks about this whole concept of blood transfusions in such, he just kind of mocks it, and he says that their new ruling where they're allowed to take fractions of blood with good conscience is similar to taking just like parts of a stolen car. You know, he kind of compares it to that in the book that he wrote, In Search of Christian Freedom. It's very interesting, his perspective on that, considering that he is now teaching, against the Jehovah's Witnesses organization and the Watchtower, when he used to be one of the ones that was considered to be the mouthpiece of God, when he considered himself to be one of the governing body. And, he left, and I highly recommend you guys read his material and look into his story, because he's saying, you know what, don't buy it, guys. Don't drink the Kool-Aid. I was one of them. I was one of the ones saying that I am, one of the mouthpieces of God here on this earth, and it's hogwash. Don't buy it. I mean, you guys got to go read his material. He's saying, don't drink the Kool-Aid, people. I was one of the ones giving you the Kool-Aid. Now I'm telling you, don't buy it. It was nonsense. It's BS. Have nothing to do with it. So look him up. Look up Raymond Franz. Jehovah's Witnesses are now allowed to accept hemoglobin. I mentioned that, which is the main component of the red blood cell. It is 15% of the blood volume, roughly, is hemoglobin. I already mentioned the scary practice of the fact that the liaison committee, the Jehovah's Witness liaison committee, stands by in the hospitals, or is called in to make sure that none of their members takes blood. It's a very grotesque practice that they have doing this, because they use their influence, their power and ability to control in a time that a family or a person is very, very vulnerable. And to me, it's the likes of murder, honestly. It is very similar to murder, because they are forcing you through shame, guilt, and fear to not do something that would save your life. And in my opinion, the blood will be on their hands, if anything, for making a person so terrified that they choose to die. They choose to allow someone they love deeply to die out of fear of the consequences that could follow if they were to just, do the thing that would save that person's life. So I have a lot of anger in my heart towards these liaison committees that are there to, I won't even go too much into detail, but I see it as a crime. I see it as a crime. It should be considered the level of crime, the level of criminal activity that should be held before the courts. It should not be allowed. The fact that it's allowed is absolutely shocking and devastating to me. I have concerns with the fact that the hospitals allow this too. I mean, where is the doctor-patient confidentiality? Where is the privacy of these individuals and families? There is none. When the Watchtower has literal spies in the hospital that are aware of the private matters of this person or family that they can report back to the organization, it's shocking to me that they have no place in that hospital, in my opinion. It's a complete invasion of privacy and human rights. And the coercion is it's bullying, it's criminal, it needs to stop. Witnesses are estimated to have roughly a 10-fold chance of having a fatal outcome as a result of refusing a transfusion when they have been medically prescribed. 10-fold. And tens of thousands have died as a result of this teaching alone. There are other medical advice changes and incongruencies throughout history with the Watchtower. Their guidance has entered every facet of life. There are no individual human rights. There is no place for a person that is a Jehovah's Witness to make their own sound medical decisions. They have changed these rules so many times in so many areas. Some of the medical teachings that have changed, like I mentioned, are the organ transplants, vaccinations, blood transfusions, and then they've got many very odd and bizarre medical teachings through the Golden Age health advice. I'm going to give you guys a few of them, but there's more. So what was the first ruling that God gave the Watchtower regarding organ transplants? And when I say that, I say it with sarcasm, because if God was to have given the advice, if it really was to have originated in him, it wouldn't have changed. But if we were to look at the Watchtower 1961, August 1st, page 480, questions from the readers, we reread. Is there anything in the Bible against giving one's eyes after death to be transplanted to some living person? The question of placing one's body or parts of one's body at the disposal of men, of science, or doctors at one's death for purposes of scientific experimentation or placement in others is frowned upon by certain religious bodies. However, it does not seem that any scriptural principle or law is involved. It therefore is something that each individual must decide for himself. Taken from the Watchtower 1961. So here they're saying there is nothing that the Bible teaches that is to say that organ transplants are wrong. So 6 years later, we have them saying God has changed his mind about this. And they say this in Watchtower 1967, November 15th, pages 702 to 704. And it reads, sustaining one's life by means of the body or part of the body of another human would be cannibalism, a practice abhorrent to all civilized people. It is not our place to decide whether such operations are advisable from a scientific or medical standpoint. Christians, who have been enlightened to God's word, do not need to make these decisions based simply on the basis of personal whim or emotion. They can consider the divine principles and use these in making personal decisions as they look to God for direction, trusting him and putting their confidence in the future that he has in store for those who love him. So these edicts on transplants, following by disfellowship directives, they lasted only for 13 years before God changed his mind again completely. In Watchtower 1980, March 15th, page 31, it says, there is no biblical command pointedly forbidding the taking in of another human tissue. It is a matter for personal decision. So there, he flip-flopped back and forth 3 times in a matter of a few years, in a matter of 13 years. So what is very sad is that witnesses as a whole, they don't even know that these teachings keep changing. They just follow whatever is being taught presently, really believing that that is God's directive on the matter, having no idea that over the last 100 and something years, it has changed roughly 14 times. Now, the founder, Russell, before Rutherford took over, he actually didn't have any issues with blood transfusions at all. He did not believe that it was necessary to abstain from blood or transfusions. It wasn't until after 50 years of the formation of the Watchtower Society that this actually became an issue. So this wasn't one of the tenets of their faith at the very beginning. The concept of not consuming blood was introduced in 1929 under the guidance of Rutherford. Yeah, Rutherford. He really came in there and messed it up. I mean, it wasn't the most awesome right from the beginning with Russell, but then once Rutherford came in, things just went to the crapper from there. But yet still, if we go on to 1940, blood transfusions were still considered an acceptable practice. In 1945, the Watchtower blood doctrine was expanded into forbidding blood transfusions. So that's when that began. And then if we look at Awake 1954, January 8th, page 24, it says, we are told it takes 1 1/3 pints of whole blood to get enough of the blood protein or fraction known as gamma globulin from one injection. And since from the foregoing, it must be admitted that such use of human blood is highly questionable, what justification can there be for the use of gamma globulin? Further, those interested in the scriptural aspect will note that its being made of whole blood places in it the same category as blood transfusions as far as Jehovah's prohibition of taking blood into the system is concerned. They were not even allowed to store their own blood. That's another issue. They weren't even allowed to store their own blood for their own use. Watchtower 1959, October 15th, page 640 says, consequently, the removal of one's blood, storing it, and later putting it back into the same person would be a violation of the scriptural principles that govern the handling of blood. So what else has changed? Previously, it was frowned upon, but a person accepting a transfusion was not dissociated, and then later on, then they would be disfellowshipped. So let's look at Watchtower 1958, August 1, page 478. We, of course, regret with you that this sister, who professes to be one of the anointed remnant, took a blood transfusion voluntarily during her stay in the hospital. We believe that she did the wrong thing contrary to the will of God. However, congregations have never been instructed to disfellowship those who voluntarily take blood transfusions or approve them. We let the judgment of such violators of God's law concerning the sacredness of blood remain with Jehovah, the supreme judge. The only thing that can be done in the cases of individuals like this is to view them as immature and therefore not capable of taking on certain responsibilities, hence refusing to make certain assignments of service to such ones. But then in 1961, blood transfusions became a disfellowshipping offense. We look at Jehovah's Witnesses, Proclaimers of God's Kingdom, pages 183 to 184. It reads, beginning in 1961, anyone who ignored the divine requirement, accepted blood transfusions, and manifested an unrepentant attitude were disfellowshipped from the congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. So what is their present position? The Watchtower, February 15th, 1963, page 124, makes clear that using either whole blood or any of its components is wrong. By the time of the Watchtower June 15th, 2000 edition, the use of most blood components was no longer considered wrong, but rather a matter of individual conscience. Then by 2004, the Watchtower showed that 100% of blood can be transfused provided it is broken down into fractions. So which doctrine did Jehovah truly sanction, or was he behind any of these at all? That's the question. Especially when your life is on the line, it's a question you might want to have the answer to. So what other crazy things have been published to have come from God, from this organization that claims to be the mouthpiece of God? There are tons of other absolutely ludicrous medical teachings that they have authored that you can go back and look up in the Golden Age. Get your hands on as many of those as possible. Some of the crazy things that they taught were that the reason why men grow bald so quickly is that they have cut their hair too frequently. That's taken from the Golden Age, 1924, November 19th, page 100. Once again, they're authoring these things as the only living mouthpiece of God, the only one to understand his truth. Let's continue on. Golden Age, 1926, April 7th, page 438. They say, if any overzealous doctor condemns your tonsils, go and commit suicide with a case knife. It's cheaper and it's less painful. So basically they're saying if the doctor says he needs to take your tonsils out, do this instead. Golden Age, 1931, August 5th, page 728. Medicine originated in demonology and spent its time until the last century and a half trying to exorcise demons. During the past half century, it has tried to exorcise germs. And there's many, many, many others of these guys. They're teaching that eating grapes and only grapes will heal cancer. They taught that you should refuse to have an appendectomy. That's a tough one. Refuse to have your appendix taken out if you have appendicitis, because all it is worms that are nibbling away inside the bowel, and that there was a herbal remedy that he put together that you should take instead. And he said that also if you had typhoid fever, just taking this instead of dealing with it through any type of medical treatment would be the way to go. He blatantly commanded that nobody has their appendix removed in an emergency situation where they're having appendicitis, that they should refuse that and just for several days take these herbs instead. And I can go on and on and on. Like I said, all of that information is going to be available to you guys in the resources. So that is about it. I really want the viewer to think about one thing, one takeaway from this video. If it truly was God's teaching, this whole thing about blood transfusions and organ donations and everything, if it really was God's teaching and he really was giving it to the Jehovah's Witnesses to share that knowledge with the world, would he have changed his position so many times throughout history? Or is it possible that those governing this organization have come up with this information themselves? And if they have come up with this information themselves, how many other doctrines are they teaching that don't originate in him, and that perhaps they are not who they claim to be? This is about it. This is Carol Bird here. Hopefully you guys will tune in to the next video. Thank you guys so much for watching.